Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Meru Media podcast. I am joined today, myself and Racchit, Racchit's actually on today too, are joined today by Professor Jeffery Long, who is a professor of religious studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. He's also part of the Vedanta Society, DANAM, which is I think the Dharma Academy of North America, if I'm correct. And he has to be honest, a library of work that he's done over his career. And the latest book that we're going to touch upon this time is his edited volume on reincarnation, which I think is a fantastic book that covers a wide survey of both the native Indian views on reincarnation, along with Western responses, and even partially even touching upon scientific areas in which reincarnation plays a role. So, Dr. Long, welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Racchit, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, nothing at all.
Okay, so Dr. Long, before we get into the book that the book on reincarnation, you did have a piece in there about how you got into Hinduism, how you got into your journey, and I know it's probably kind of you do it on every podcast or every interview on, but I think it's such a fascinating journey, not just because of your background, but to see the worlds apart. Like last week we had Ram Dass Lam come on, and he was spending his journey too, which is also incredibly fascinating. And to see how many of us take for granted the things that you guys came through, either through your punarjanma jnana or like the samskaras that connect you, or like your life experiences. For us, we just take it for granted. For many of us born into the tradition, for you, it's a process, it's a journey, it's a transformation. And I think it's important to capture how that happened. So if you would.
Sure, I can talk about that. And thank you very much again for inviting me on and just the chance to share with your audience. Yes, I was not born to the Hindu tradition. In fact, I grew up in a Roman Catholic family in a small town in Missouri, and in fact, very much a Bible Belt sort of town. Even being Catholic there was considered a little radical, I think, to some people, because it was a very conservative sort of Protestant perspective was predominant there. And I grew up in a Catholic family. I was a very devout child growing up, but I was also very curious and open-minded. I wasn't dogmatic in my worldview, and I was always very interested in science. I loved reading about astronomy and dinosaurs, and very strongly influenced by science fiction. I probably was as influenced by Star Trek and Star Wars as by the Catholic Church in terms of forming my worldview. And I think I'm a typical American in that way. I think pop culture is really where we get a lot of our values, and really kind of shapes the way we tend to think. When I was very young, I was 10, and my father was in a really terrible accident, and he was very, very badly injured. He was in the hospital for several months, then rehabilitation, and then finally back at home. And my mother pretty much gave up any kind of outside work she had. She worked part-time in a bank, but she dedicated herself to taking care of him. And I didn't have any brothers or sisters. It was just me and my parents. Large extended family, but the nuclear family was just the three of us. And his situation was so bad. His body had really become something like a prison to him because of his injuries. And he ended up taking his own life. And that happened when I was 12. So about an 18-month period of really just kind of an intensive suffering and really a complete disruption of our lives. Worst, of course, for my father and my mother, but for me too. I mean, that was my family. And so in the aftermath of all of that, I really began thinking a lot about questions like, what happens after we die? What kind of afterlife is there? Is there an afterlife? Why is there so much suffering in the world? And so on. And of course, a lot of responses, a lot of answers to this can be found in Christian traditions. And the Catholic Church was I would say, the cradle, I would say, where my spirituality was formed in this life. And I took a lot of comfort in the idea of a loving God, for example, the idea that there was something other than the body, that it's not just that we die and that's it, that the journey continues. In fact, I perceived that during the period of my father's injury, because when your body actually turns against you, You know, if your body can be your enemy, that means we are not this body, right? There is something
Right.
distinct between this physical entity and what we think of as the self. And so I took a lot of comfort in those teachings, but I had questions too. And like I said, I was always sort of, open-minded, looking at different theories and ideas. And it seemed to me that the traditional idea of heaven and hell that we see in Christianity, I felt that was lacking somewhere. That I didn't think my father was in hell because I thought he'd already gone through it. Right? He had experienced so
Right.
much suffering in this life already. There, of course, not as many people believe this nowadays, but the traditional Christian teaching is people who take their own life go to hell. Well, I didn't believe that. At the same time, I really was not quite ready to accept the idea that after this one life we just go to heaven, because heaven was described as this place of perfection, and we're all pretty imperfect. I mean, whatever, my view of myself and of others is that people tend to be basically good for the most part, but that we all have certain insufficiencies, we have certain ignorances and tendencies that cause us to be less than perfect. And much as my father had suffered, I didn't think that he was a perfect being. Now, in the Catholic Church, there's this idea of purgatory, sort of an intermediate state between heaven and hell, where the soul goes and sort of learns certain things and experiences certain kinds of suffering, where the imperfections are kind of burned off, and then you're able to go on to perfection. But the question I had about that was, if we're not done yet at the end of this life with that process, what was the point of this life? What were we doing here? Why don't we just start in purgatory and move on from there? And so then the idea occurred to me, maybe we're already in purgatory. Maybe we just keep coming back here and experiencing things and learning until we reach some kind of perfection. And this was just my thinking coming from within a Christian context, but just trying to rationalize the way I understood things. And then I started learning about Hinduism, and that happened again through popular culture. Two big things. One was the Beatles. I think a lot of Westerners got our first introduction through, George Harrison and his journey, and I felt really drawn to his music and what he was saying. And then the movie Gandhi came out when I was 13. So this is like in this aftermath of everything that had happened. So Dad died when I was 12, 13. I'm listening to the Beatles. I'm seeing Gandhi. And all these things are coming together. And I'm just thinking, okay, India seems to be this really great source of wisdom about these things. And both in George Harrison's songs and then in things I started reading about Gandhi. And then there was this book on Hinduism, or really Asian religions generally, and science, called The Tao of Physics, pretty famous book now. And all these sources mentioned the Bhagavad Gita. And I started thinking, well, this Bhagavad Gita sounds like really an amazing book. This seems like the source that I need to go back to. And the really neat event that happened to me, that I see as sort of really pivotal in my life. So I was 13, turning 14, and I went to this flea market, this sale in the parking lot of the local Methodist church, and I was there to help my grandmother because she would sell things and buy things at these markets all the time. But I would also find old comic books and science fiction paperbacks and that sort of thing. So I was on the lookout for those. And what I didn't expect was what I found. I went to this card table and had all these old magazines on it, and right on top, here's this book. It says, The Bhagavad Gita, as it is. And it was the translation by Prabhupada, the founder of ISKCON. And it's beautiful artwork. And I opened it up, and the first page I turned to, there's this painting of a man who has died, and he's surrounded by his mourning family. And in the distance, there's this sage who's looking at all of them very serenely, and he can see God in all of them. And you see this little image of Lord Krishna over everyone's heart. And there's this verse that's quoted at the bottom. It says, "The wise lament neither the living nor the dead." And those words really spoke to me. I was really grabbed by this, and it gave a page number. So I turned to the page number, and it's the second chapter of the Gita, where Lord Krishna is explaining to Arjuna that there was never a time when we did not exist, nor a time when we will cease to be. That just as we cast off old and worn out clothing and put on new clothes, so the soul casts off the body and takes on a new body. And it just made perfect sense. And it spoke to me, and it was as if this thought process that I was already having was being confirmed by something from this very ancient culture from the other side of the world. And I sometimes tell people in that moment, the way I felt was it's almost as if you were an extraterrestrial raised by human parents and then came across an artifact from your home planet. That's how I felt when I found the Gita. It was just this is the first thing I found that just made complete sense. Right there were things I'd grown up in the church. There were things that I really loved about it, but things that didn't quite make sense to me. And this just it just all came together so beautifully. And to sort of make a long story short, I mean, that led to a whole lifetime of reading and studying about many different traditions, becoming a scholar of religion, but also in my personal life, becoming a practitioner in the Hindu tradition. I was a practitioner of Siddha Yoga for a period of time and really gained a lot from that. But eventually I found my spiritual home in the Ramakrishna tradition. And that's where I've been for over 20 years. And formally took Diksha 14 years ago.
Okay.
And just this past year, my wife and I have started the Vedanta Society of Central Pennsylvania right here in our house. So that's in its infancy, or even maybe prenatal stage. It's still very early in its beginnings. But we've gone from an email list of 12 people to 31 people within the last year. And we have our satsangs every couple months, and people come here. And we also, of course, go to the other Vedanta societies.
Sure.
DC is the closest one to us. Our guru is in Boston. We go there whenever we can. And I'm also occasionally invited to speak at the Vedanta societies.
Right.
In fact, I'll be speaking at the one in New York on June 16th. So coming up very soon.
Excellent.
That's my story in a nutshell.
It's really interesting because growing up in Southern California, there's Vedanta societies everywhere. In like San Diego, there's one in Orange County, LA. So like my dad used to take us to the Vedanta society growing up too, and my exposure to Vivekananda and Ramakrishna was later in life in terms of their philosophy or thought. But he did mention them as we're going, because I belong to a specific sampradaya, which is Sri Vaishnavism, or Vishishtadvaita Sampradaya. So I grew up in that. I'm not necessarily part of it now, but I that's kind of like my philosophical background. My epistemology and my metaphysics are really aligned with that. So, Racchit, do you have anything to add? Because I have a couple of questions I want to follow up.
Absolutely. And I guess, even I should talk about my sort of exposure to Ramakrishna. So, myself, being from Uttarakhand in Garhwal, right, some from the Himalayas, and come from more of a Shakta background. So I found Ramakrishna very fascinating because of his own experiences, right? Yes. He was a Devi Bhakta, par excellence. And so, he's just been so fascinating to me. And also the connection of his personal Shaktism versus, Vivekananda and the Vedanta societies, Vedanta. It's also something very interesting to me. And, I guess at some point in this discussion, I'd really love to hear your views about that.
Sure.
So I guess my follow-up to you, Dr. Long, would be how would you differentiate the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Sampradaya, the Vedanta Sampradaya, versus the other Sampradayas that exist in the Hindu fold? What's particular about that makes it its own?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that is one of the differentiating marks of this particular Sampradaya has to do with Ramakrishna's pluralistic experiences. The fact that he undertook sadhanas within numerous Hindu sampradayas, and then even extended his reach into Christianity and Islam to some extent. I do think the last two sometimes are overstated a bit. I mean, he was never baptized, for example. I mean, I don't think he was a Christian or a Muslim in the sense that most Christians or Muslims would recognize. But he saw divinity in Christ, right? He saw divinity in the God proclaimed in Islam. So he wanted to experience divinity in every possible form, and including the formless form, including through Advaita, through his sadhanas with Totapuri, who was an Advaita teacher that came to him at one point in his life. And in each of the traditions he undertook a sadhana, he would pursue it wholeheartedly until he achieved the state of samadhi, the state of complete absorption and unification with whatever Ishtadevata, with whatever form of divinity was at the centerpiece of that sampradaya. So this whole tradition, and I think Swami Vivekananda said it very well, it is Vedanta. It's rooted in the Vedas and specifically in the Upanishads, but it interprets these through the lens of the life of Ramakrishna. So it gives it a particular kind of pluralistic flavor, you could say. So whereas maybe what you might call a classical Advaita Vedanta, and I hope I'm not setting up a straw man in any sense here, but it's typically understood as affirming the reality of Brahman alone and the unreality of the world, right? Jagad Mitya, right? The world is unreal, and so on. And you find statements to that effect in Ramakrishna's teaching as well. At the same time, though, there is, I mean, as Racchit mentioned, there's this whole Shakta element of Ramakrishna. And Ramakrishna affirms that the same Brahman that is the sort of passive foundation or ground of all existence is in its active form the Shakti, who is the Divine Mother, who is present in all beings and present in the world. So what I think differentiates a big part of the difference between the Vedanta of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and what we might call a sort of classical Advaita Vedanta is maybe a little more of an affirmation of the reality of the world and the validity of experiences like bhakti, for example. And Ramakrishna quoted Ramprasad, famous bhakta, saying, you know, I want to eat sugar, I don't want to become sugar. Right? And so talking about, you know, remaining within the dualistic plane of reality. So I think it's ultimately not so much an ontological difference. I mean, I see in our Vedanta tradition, there is this idea that the ultimate reality is the Nirguna Brahman, and everything else is in some sense derivative from that. But that rather than affirming that everything else is therefore unreal, it's more like saying this is a different plane of reality. It's an alternate way of looking at existence. And depending on one's personal makeup and one's own spiritual path, one can choose to experience through the modality of dualism or qualified non-dualism or pure non-dualism, and that these are all seen as valid in the Ramakrishna tradition. So there's less of a sense that there is one true and final path for everyone, and more of a sense that each of us has our own sanskars, we have our own histories that situate us in a particular place in relation to the infinite. And so our means of achieving that realization are going to differ accordingly. And in fact, there's a really, someone I don't know if you've interviewed yet or might consider, he's Swami in training with the Ramakrishna order named Ayan Maharaj. And he's just written a book, it just came out last year, called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. And he's really articulating this extremely well. Like, what is the distinctive teaching of this sampradaya? And he uses the term Vijnana Vedanta to define Ramakrishna's Vedanta. And he traces that term back to the Upanishads. And he really sees it as a kind of a non-sectarian Vedanta. Right? It's you know, any perspective you want to present, whether Vishishtadvaita or Advaita or, you know, any of these, can be seen within the Ramakrishna perspective as having a sphere of validity. So I think that's really kind of the heart of it.
Okay. Racchit?
Oh, no, nothing at all.
Because I mean, I was about to say, in some sense, it feels much like I would say normal sampradaya broken free of its traditional restrictions. In some sense, right? In terms of conceptions of how to interact with other groups of thought, people. I mean, like Islam, Christianity, or whatever. It kind of falls under the purview then of the same universal vision, as opposed to something that requires only a Vedika path or something of that nature, right? Because I mean, like for example, Shankara's big in his Kevala Advaita, his big thing would be like, only Dvijas can get moksha because they have to learn the Upanishads, and the only person that can get the Upanishad access would be Dvijas. Well, in Ramakrishna's, it's clear that the experiential nature of that intuitive knowledge is more powerful than anything you get from like a text or anything.
That's right, and in fact, Swami Vivekananda makes this very explicit, and he's quite critical of traditional concepts of adhikar. He really sees this as unduly restricting the spiritual. He said, you can't contain the infinite in any container.
Right.
So what one of the things that drew me to it was its rejection of the kinds of fundamentalisms and exclusivisms you see in Christianity, which is what I grew up with.
Right.
But you could see that from an internal Hindu perspective as well, as being critical of things like caste restrictions or even the insistence on one particular devata as, the true devata. And so these sorts of restrictions really, this tradition goes against the grain of that type of thinking.
So does the tradition also require vegetarianism, non-alcohol, non-tobacco, those kind of traditional, what's it called, the deveshas or whatever?
It does, but it's much more, I don't want to say relaxed, because that would sort of give the wrong impression. But it starts with people where they are.
Okay.
So it doesn't insist from the very beginning that one observe such restrictions. What I've learned in the tradition, and in fact, I can even say this experientially, just from my short lifetime so far of practice, that once one begins the practice, some of what are traditionally thought of as restrictions just become your natural mode of being.
Okay.
And you simply become repelled by something like alcohol because you know that it doesn't create within you the kind of awareness and the kind of inner sense that's conducive to what you want to achieve. It militates against your meditation practice, and that's the most important thing in your life. So you're like, no, I don't want to do that. So it's less of a sense of restrictions, like you are not allowed to do this, and more of a sense of, well, these are the values, these are what you're trying to achieve, and you find through experience that certain kinds of activities, certain kinds of behaviors just aren't compatible with that. And there's a famous story from the life of Ramakrishna, in fact, about this. One of his disciples, a man named Girish Ghosh, was a playwright and quite a bohemian in his lifestyle and big drinker. And one of the things Ramakrishna was always encouraging him to, give up alcohol. And he said, this is one thing I can't do. This is part of my life. So Ramakrishna has said something very interesting to him. He said, okay, he said, next time you drink, before you drink, offer it up to the Divine Mother. Make it into prasad, right? So whenever you have a drink, first offer it to the Divine Mother. Now, from an Orthodox perspective, that's very inappropriate, right? Offering alcohol to, as prasad, that doesn't seem right. But Ghosh started following this advice, and within a few weeks, he completely lost his desire for alcohol. And it just stopped and didn't go back to his old alcoholic habits. So the attitude of the tradition is that what we often think of as these sorts of restrictions, it's the way that an awakened soul would just normally behave, right? The spontaneous, normal behavior of someone who is tuned into divinity is such that it avoids violence, it avoids certain kinds of substances that aren't good for the mind, aren't good for the body. And so cultivating that desire for the realization of divinity is going to simply make certain things unattractive. So while there are definitely moral expectations in the tradition, I find it's not something that's talked about extensively. It's more, people will ask the swamis, they'll ask their guru, they'll say, what should I do about this? And generally the advice is, well, this is the ideal, this is what you should be doing and not doing, but where are you now? And now let's work toward getting you there. Because very often I find that people who maybe already, especially us Westerners, right? We come from this culture where it's like a lot of the things that are taken for granted are very bad habits from a traditional spiritual point of view. Sure. And if you try to put all of that away immediately, it's going to become very difficult to practice. Now, some people can do it, but I compare it sometimes to people who come up with a really elaborate exercise and diet regimen for their health. And maybe it's a New Year's resolution. Okay, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. every day, and I'm going to do 100 push-ups, and I'm going to jog 10 miles. And, by January 3rd, you've given up, and you're back to your old habits because it's just too hard. But, like little bit every day, little bit of, the whole baby steps philosophy.
Yeah.
I think that's what I've experienced more as the approach of the tradition. One qualification I'll add to that is I think this is the way we practice it in the West, because I think Swami Vivekananda came to America with the understanding that, these Westerners, they're already caught up in this very materialistic way of life. We're going to have to gradually get them on board with, the right way of living. My understanding is things are a bit more strict in India. Like if you go to a Ramakrishna Mission school, for example, it's going to be pretty strict right from the beginning. And the idea is, I think that Indians have grown up with this culture.
Right.
I think that difference might be breaking down, though. I don't know if there's as much difference between, say, an urbanized Indian nowadays and a Westerner in terms of personal habits. Things have changed so much in India.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, Racchit.
Yeah, absolutely, Professor Long. And I'll talk about my experience. I'm being one of those urbanized Indians, almost like a brown sahib growing up, right? Went to one of those colonial schools.
Yeah.
And my interaction with Indian culture was there through my family. We used to go up to the mountains, to the traditional village where my family is from, and, the towns up there. But at the same time, most of my time was spent around people who, was growing up studying English literature, being able to speak and read and write in English in a very sophisticated manner was something that was considered a good goal in life. And so there was a falling away from the culture, and my rediscovery of my culture after coming to the U.S. for my undergraduate studies actually involved an experience that was very similar to yours. I was exposed to books by Yogananda, Vivekananda, reading about the life of Ramakrishna, and then slowly there was going back towards more traditional Hinduism. But you're right. Those barriers have definitely fallen apart. And I also say this, coming from Uttarakhand, our dietary habits are also very different from the rest of the country. In the mountains, whether it's Nepal or where I'm from, even Kashmir, meat eating is common. Alcohol drink is also very common. So even the interactions with Indians from different parts of the country was very interesting, because what was considered okay achara up there, is somehow not okay in UP or with people from southern India. So that whole experience for me also has been, I guess, very similar to yours.
Oh, that's true. And Bengal, of course, is very big on fish eating. And in fact, my wife is Bengali by background, and fish is just a big part of the diet. And it's even used in metaphors. Ramakrishna would use fishing-related metaphors very often in his teaching. One expression that he used a lot when he would teach someone something, and if they found that there were aspects of it that were difficult to accept, but he wanted them to get the essence of it and not get too hung up on those details, he would say, "Leave the head and the tail." So the image is if someone's eating fish and it's like, well, I don't know about this head and tail. It's like, well, okay, don't worry about that part, but get the middle part. And so that I think those variations in Indian culture are also a big thing that we see.
Right.
So how much do you think, for example, so Ramakrishna's background, obviously he's Bengali, and so is Vivekananda. So Shaktism is pretty big in the Bengal region. So do you have indication how he picked the particular form of Devi and why he chose that, and kind of what his practice was when he was engaging in that?
On a purely historical level, it just seems to have been almost an accident of history that his family were Ram devotees. And in fact, all the family's names were in some way derivative of Ram or Vishnu. In fact, his given name was Gadadhar, so the bearer of the mace, Gadadhar Chattopadhyay. So they were Ram devotees. And his older brother, they were very poor. His older brother, they were Brahmins. He got a job as one of the priests at this Kali temple in Dakshineshwar, which is sort of north of Calcutta. And now the urban sprawl of Calcutta has encompassed it. But it was north of Calcutta, and it was Kali temple, and it was actually constructed by and owned by a woman for her caste background was Shudra, named Rani Vashmani. And this is something I think good for some listeners to know, that what is sometimes called caste in the Western world is not the same as class. And though this woman came from what's called the servant or Shudra caste, she was marvelously wealthy, and she lived in a house that was palatial, and you can see photographs of it from that period. And she built this temple, and some of the more, I guess you could say, orthodox Brahmins were not comfortable serving in a temple owned by a low-caste woman, but when you're poor and you need the work. And so Ramakrishna's brother took the job there, and then Ramakrishna went with him as sort of his apprentice. And when he was only about 19, his brother died suddenly, and just got ill, took ill and died unexpectedly. So then Ramakrishna had to take over his brother's priestly duties, and it's said that he underwent, I wouldn't call it a crisis of faith, but he actually had a lot of integrity. He said to himself, if I'm going to worship this goddess, if I'm going to spend every day in this ritualistic worship, I need to know that she's real. I need to see her. I need to experience her. So he began, this is the first of his many famous sadhanas, was just crying out in longing to Ma Kali, I want to see you, I want to see you. That almost reminds me of the George Harrison song, My Sweet Lord, I really want to see you, really want to be. And each day that would pass when he would not have the vision of the Divine Mother, he'd go to bed weeping. He would say, oh Ma, another day has passed and I have not seen you. And then finally he reached the point where he was about to take his own life in desperation. Right? He was just full of this desperation to see the Divine Mother. And there was a sword hanging on the wall in the temple, and he was going to go and take it and cut his own throat. And then at that moment he was overwhelmed by this vision of an ocean of light. Mm-hmm. And it overwhelmed him, it encompassed him fully, and he realized that this was the Divine Mother in her true form. And he had this experience, and he entered into this very deeply God-intoxicated state, which he remained in for days after. And he began to behave like some of the classic mad bhaktas, because he could see the Divine Mother everywhere. So he fed the prasad to a cat, for example, and people were outraged. And he said, well, Ma's in the cat as well as in the murti, so why shouldn't I feed her? And so this was the beginning of his journey, because then after that he undertook a series of, like we said before, of sadhanas of various kinds, Vaishnava, Shaiva, and so on. However, his default was always Ma Kali. He always went back to her, because I think that was his first really profound spiritual experience. There are stories of him going into spontaneous samadhi even in his childhood, but and these would be evoked by sometimes just by natural beauty. He once saw some geese flying in the sky, and there were storm clouds overhead, and just the contrast of the white geese and the gray clouds was so beautiful that it sent him into this altered state. And once when he was a child, he was in a play about the gods, and he was dressed up like Lord Shiva, and he got up onto the stage and he became Shiva. He went into samadhi. But in terms of like following a sadhana and then having samadhi as its outcome, his first experience was at this Ma Kali temple. So from a historical perspective, you could just say it's an accident of history. His older brother happened to get hired at this place and then died, and then left him to take over these duties. And that left him with his very peculiar spiritual character, saying, well, I can only serve a goddess that I really have seen and believe is real. And so that's really where Ma Kali became the centerpiece of his devotion. And his last word when he left his body is he called out the name of Kali 3 times before he passed away. So he died with her name on his lips. And so this was his Ishtadevata, his symbol of complete devotion. And now what I keep saying from a historical perspective, it may be that there's some deeper metaphysical reason why Ramakrishna came as the Ma Kali Bhakt that he is. Because I think, especially for Westerners, Ma Kali is one of the most challenging Hindu deities to sort of grasp, because from a conventional perspective, she looks pretty scary, right? She's, and then of course you have the whole Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom type of imagery out there, and so on. And the fact that not at Dakshineshwar, but at the Kali Ghat, that very famous or infamous Kali temple in Calcutta, they still sacrifice goats to the present day. So a lot of people associate her with with blood and violence and so on. And I think Ramakrishna's devotion to her challenges us to really see God everywhere, not only in forms that we find benevolent or appealing, but even in this fearsome form, there is divinity present. So I see a deeper reason why Kali, but historically, yeah, just that's where he ended up.
Yeah. Racchit?
Nothing really to add over here, Professor Long. I think you really hit upon this really, really well. Thank you.
So I have, it's interesting. I got 2 points, right? Like, you're totally correct about the inability for a lot of the Western world, and probably actually not just the Western world, a lot of even Indians themselves to not understand Kali fully, right? Like, it's she's seen as this fearsome deity that's in the back that you be scared of. I mean, for example, Jordan Peterson came out with like this, I think like a 45-minute lecture on Kali, which was, I think, totally just bupkis. It was just made up from like this Jungian perspective, and didn't make sense with the tradition, right? The tradition has a very beautiful sense of what Kali represents, right? Because it's Kali in some sense is a standalone deity, but also connected to Durga and Shakti on the whole, right? Just like every single person has many facets, Mother has so many different facets, right? Like, especially when she's like trying to protect her devotees or her children, she behaves fearsome like Kali would, right? And it's a way to cut down, like, for example, your desires, because they're, I mean, Racchit is actually better to maybe talk about this, but her killing Raktabija and drinking the blood, which that depiction comes from, is such a psychologically important concept of our desires rising up incessantly, and only with like this viciousness are you able to get rid of them, and you have to kind of absorb them into you. I mean, Racchit, do you have anything to say about particularly this story?
I mean, this would be a whole nother conversation. I could go on and for days about it. But I mean, it is, for most people, Kali is this fearsome deity, which is kind of hidden away, and coming from a culture where Durga, Chandi, Chamunda, they're part of our daily lives. My whole experience growing up was very different. And so it's Kali really is more of a benevolent deity to us. I mean, she is fearsome to us because of the kleshas and vikaras inside us. And that's the whole point of it. She takes no prisoners. She's like, I'm going to chop, off the root of your ego right away. It's not the Samya form of the Devi, the Mahadevi, because she's everything, right? She's all of existence. It's, that would be Shri, but you've got the Kalikula as well, saying that, hey, you know what, there's the other side of the coin. And for us to come to terms with reality as a whole, we have to be able to engage and face up to the ultimate reality in its Rudra form. Just like with the Vishvarupam of Vishnu, right? When Krishna shows Arjuna, it's something that Arjuna can handle. So, that's.
I mean, Kali herself is called Bhadra Kali, right? The gentle Kali, right? Yeah. So it's just like, even though you see the fearsome form, and in her heart to her devotees, she's gentle, she's Soumya, she's loving, right? It's a very like, and this is, I think, one of the beauty of the tradition we have is at least Hindus, in the sense is, you can find that beauty, you can find that gentleness in all things, and that perfection in all things, whether or not it appears scary or appears not scary. There's this perfection that kind of cuts through everything in whatever form you kind of approach God or Devi or whatever you want to call, right?
Right. No, I think you've put that very beautifully, and I think the protective aspect is a really important one. At least as I've come to understand it, and as I've explained it to a lot of my students who are mostly from a Western background, say, think of how angry and frightening your mother becomes if she thinks you're threatened in some way, right? I mean, it can be terrifying, and I just came back from Japan, and every Buddhist temple has these fearsome guardian deities, right? These dharma guardians, and they're glowering, and they have weapons, and again, from a sort of Western perspective, they might appear demonic, but they're there to drive away the evil, and as you said, drive away our own evil. You mentioned our kleshas, our imperfections. I always think of the head, the severed head of the Raktabija that Ma Kali is holding, as representative of the ego, and when we have this expression in English, having things go to your head or getting big-headed, standing, and she just cuts it right off, and that is her role. And I have found her to be very empowering and life-giving image of divinity. But yes, for many Westerners, that's a hard thing to come to terms with, because we're very often presented with, God is love, God is loving, God is benevolent. Now, Kali is also loving and benevolent, but this is a way that this is manifested. And of course, the Western tradition is not without its fierce side of God. The the Old Testament sort of, wrathful God. And in fact, in some ways, getting to know Ma Kali has helped me understand that tradition better too. Because a lot of Westerners grow up sort of repelled by that image of God. And,
Right.
and it is repelling if it translates into, well, we should therefore also go out and, slay the unbelievers, all that sort of thing is, all unacceptable. But looking at it as, yes, there is this dimension of reality that is fierce and that is frightening and that is part of the totality of the infinite that we're trying to realize.